The year was 2002 when John Darwin, a prison officer from England, paddled his red canoe into the cold North Sea waters near his home in Seaton Carew and never came back. His shattered canoe washed ashore. Search teams scoured the coastline for days. His wife grieved publicly. His 2 sons were devastated. The authorities eventually declared him dead. Life insurance paid out over £250,000. But 13 years later, a single photograph would emerge that would shock the entire world and expose one of the most audacious and cruel deception schemes ever perpetrated. Because John Darwin wasn't dead. He had been alive the entire time, hiding in plain sight, while his own children mourn a father who was actually living right next door. This is a story about how far people will go for money, about the lies we tell ourselves to justify the unforgivable, and about how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing when we least expect it. It's a story that asks uncomfortable questions about love, family, and whether some betrayals are simply too great to ever forgive. Let's go back to the beginning. John Darwin was 57 years old when he supposedly died. He worked as a prison officer, but like many people, he had dreams that extended beyond his modest salary. He and his wife had accumulated significant debt, nearly £700,000 worth, from failed property investments and a lifestyle they couldn't quite afford. The financial pressure was crushing them. They owned several properties but were hemorrhaging money, unable to keep up with mortgage payments, and facing the very real prospect of bankruptcy and losing everything they'd worked for. John Darwin was not a criminal mastermind. He was an ordinary man with ordinary problems that had spiraled out of control. But somewhere in his desperation, an extraordinary idea took root. What if he simply disappeared? What if he died, at least on paper? The life insurance policies would pay out and could claim his pension. They could escape their debts and start fresh somewhere else. It was fraud, certainly, but in John's mind, it was a victimless crime. The insurance companies were massive corporations. They could afford it. This rationalization is common among people who commit insurance fraud. They convince themselves that they're not really hurting anyone, that they're just working the system, gaming it in their favor. But there would be victims. 2 of them, his own sons, who were to live with the grief of losing their father. On March 21st, 2002, John Darwin put his plan into action. He took his canoe out into the North Sea. The waters were rough that day, the kind of conditions that could easily prove fatal to even an experienced kayaker. John deliberately left his canoe in a position where it would be found damaged, suggesting a tragic accident. Then he simply walked away, making his way back to his home in Seaton Carew, where and was waiting. The authorities were notified. A massive search and rescue operation was launched, involving lifeboats, helicopters, and coastal rescue teams. They searched for hours, then days, finding nothing. John Darwin's sons, Mark and Anthony, rushed to be with their mother. They were in their early 20s, young men who suddenly found themselves mourning their father, and played her role perfectly. She appeared distraught, worried, desperate for news. She gave interviews to local media, pleading for information about her husband. She cooperated fully with authorities. No one suspected a thing. Why would they? A man had gone kayaking in dangerous conditions and hadn't returned. It was a tragedy, but tragically common. People die in accidents all the time. After several weeks with no sign of John, the search was called off. But John couldn't be declared legally dead immediately. In the United Kingdom, there's typically a waiting period before someone can be declared dead in absentia. This period is usually 7 years, though it can be shorter in cases where death is presumed due to specific circumstances, and would have to wait. In the meantime, she and John continued their deception in ways that would become almost farcical if they weren't so heartbreaking for the sons involved. Here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. John didn't flee to some distant country immediately after his disappearance. He stayed close, very close. The Darwins owned several properties in Seaton Carew, including the house next door to their family home. John moved into that property, living literally next door to where his grieving sons would visit their mother. He stayed hidden there for weeks, then months, living in the shadows of his old life, and would bring him food, supplies, and presumably company. It's almost impossible to imagine the psychological state required to maintain such a deception. Every day, John Darwin woke up knowing his children believed him dead. Every day, and comforted her sons while knowing their father was alive just meters away. The sons visited regularly in those early months after the disappearance. They tried to support their mother through her grief. They planned a memorial service. They dealt with a painful process of accepting that their father was gone. And all the while, John was so close, he could probably hear their voices through the walls. This wasn't just insurance fraud. This was a profound betrayal of the parent-child relationship. A betrayal so deep that it's difficult to fully comprehend the mindset behind it. What kind of person can listen to their own children grieve while choosing to remain hidden? What kind of love, if we can even call it that, allows for such cruelty? But John and Ann had convinced themselves that what they were doing was necessary. They had to wait for the life insurance to pay out. They had to establish the fiction of John's death thoroughly enough that no one would question it. They had debts to pay and a new life to build. In their minds, they had crossed a line, and the only way forward was to keep going. This is another common pattern in fraud and deception. Once you've committed to a lie of this magnitude, every day that passes makes it harder to come clean. The lie takes on a life of its own. It becomes something you have to protect, maintain, and nurture. And the longer it goes on, the more impossible it becomes to imagine telling the truth. After several months of hiding in the property next door, John eventually moved further afield. He couldn't stay in Seton Carew forever. The risk of being spotted was too great. Using false documents, he began the process of creating a new identity. This proved easier than you might imagine. In the early 2000s, identity verification wasn't as sophisticated as it is today. John Darwin obtained a birth certificate for a deceased infant, a common technique used by people attempting to create false identities. Using this document, he was able to apply for other forms of identification, building a paper trail for his new persona. He traveled. He spent time in various locations around the United Kingdom, always careful to avoid places where he might be recognized, and continued to live in Seton Carew, maintaining the fiction for their sons and for the authorities. She was a grieving widow, struggling to rebuild her life after tragedy. In December 2003, nearly 2 years after John's disappearance, and went to the authorities and requested that her husband be declared legally dead. The normal waiting period hadn't elapsed, but given the circumstances of his disappearance, the evidence of the damaged canoe, and the extensive search that had found no trace of him, her request was granted. John Darwin was officially declared dead. The death certificate was issued. This was what they had been waiting for. The life insurance paid out and received over £250,000. She also claimed John's pension and other benefits. The Darwins suddenly had the money they needed to escape their debts and start over. But they didn't want to start over in England. They wanted to go somewhere warm, somewhere cheap, somewhere they could live comfortably on their fraudulent windfall. They began researching destinations, looking for the perfect place to begin their new life together. They settled on Panama. Panama was an attractive option for several reasons. It was affordable, it had a tropical climate, and most importantly, it had a program specifically designed to attract foreign retirees. The Pension-to-Do program offered significant benefits to retirees who moved to Panama, including discounts on various services and relatively easy residency requirements. John and Ann began planning their move and made several trips to Panama starting in 2004, looking at properties and establishing connections there. She was preparing the ground for their eventual relocation. But there was a problem. John needed a passport, and getting a passport in a false name, even with the documents he'd acquired, was risky. So John did something almost unbelievably brazen. In December 2007, he walked into a London police station and claimed to have amnesia. He said he didn't know who he was or where he'd been. He gave his name as John Jones. He said his memory was a complete blank, but he thought he might have been living as a homeless person. The police were sympathetic. They tried to help him figure out his identity. They took his photograph and fingerprints. They ran his details through their databases, and they discovered who he really was. John Darwin, the man who had died in 2002, was suddenly very much alive. The police contacted Anne. She rushed to London to be reunited with her husband. She appeared shocked, overcome with emotion, unable to believe that her husband had returned from the dead after more than 5 years. She told reporters that it was a miracle, that she couldn't believe John was alive. The story made headlines across the United Kingdom. The man who came back from the dead. The kayaker who survived. It seemed like an incredible story of survival against all odds. The initial assumption was that John had suffered some kind of accident, developed amnesia, and had been living rough for years without knowing who he was. These cases, while rare, do occasionally happen. The media ate it up. It was a feel-good story, a tale of a family reunited after years of heartbreak. But there were problems with John's story almost immediately. For one thing, he looked remarkably healthy for someone who had supposedly been living homeless for 5 years. He wasn't malnourished. He didn't have the kind of health issues you'd expect from someone living on the streets. He was tanned, well-fed, and generally appeared to have been living quite comfortably. The police began to ask questions. Where had he been? How had he survived? If he had amnesia, why had it suddenly lifted? John's answers were vague and inconsistent. He claimed he couldn't remember anything about the past 5 years. He said it was all a blank. But if that was true, how did he know to walk into a police station and seek help? The investigation intensified. Detectives started looking into Anne's financial affairs. They discovered that she'd been making trips to Panama. They discovered that she'd been looking at properties there. And then they discovered something that would blow the entire case wide open. An anonymous tip led investigators to a photograph posted on a website for a property company in Panama. The photograph was from July 2006, more than 4 years after John had supposedly died. It showed a smiling couple standing with an estate agent. The couple was labeled as John, Anne, and Darwin. There was no mistaking them. This was the photograph that would change everything. The photograph showed John Darwin very much alive in 2006, years before he walked into that police station claiming amnesia. It showed him with Anne, both of them looking happy and relaxed, clearly in Panama looking at properties together. The photograph made a mockery of the amnesia story. It proved that John had been alive and in contact with Anne for years. It proved that the entire thing had been a fraud from the beginning. The photograph went viral almost immediately. It was published in newspapers across the United Kingdom and around the world. The reaction was one of shock, anger, and disbelief. This wasn't a miraculous survival story. This was a calculated fraud. And worst of all, it was a fraud that had required John and Darwin to let their own sons believe their father was dead for over 5 years. The public was outraged. The deception was bad enough, but the fact that they had put their own children through years of grief made it unconscionable. Anne was arrested. She initially tried to maintain the amnesia story, but when confronted with the photograph, her defense crumbled. She eventually admitted that she and John had faked his death to claim the life insurance money. She claimed that she had been coerced by John, that she was a victim of his manipulation, that she had never wanted to go through with it. But investigators didn't buy it, and had been an active participant in the fraud. She had made the insurance claims. She had traveled to Panama to set up their new life. She had comforted her sons while knowing their father was alive. She was no victim. John and Darwin were both charged with fraud. The prosecution case was devastating. They presented evidence of the planning that had gone into the scheme, the false insurance claims, the trips to Panama, and most damningly, that photograph. John and Anne's defense teams tried to argue various mitigating factors. John claimed that financial desperation had driven him to it, and claimed that she had been under John's control, that he had manipulated her into participating. Neither defense held much water. The jury heard testimony from Mark and Anthony Darwin, John and Anne's sons. Their testimony was heart-wrenching. They described the grief they'd felt when their father disappeared. They described how they tried to support their mother. They described finding out that their father had been alive all along, and that both of their parents had lied to them for years. Mark Darwin described the moment he saw the photograph from Panama. He said it felt like his father had died all over again, except this time the death was metaphorical. The father he thought he'd known had never really existed. Anthony Darwin spoke about the betrayal of trust. He said that he could have forgiven many things, but not this, not the deliberate decision to let him and his brother grieve for years, while their father was alive and hiding. He said that in some ways, it would have been better if his father really had died that day in 2002. At least then the grief would have been honest. Instead, they had to grapple with the knowledge that their own parents had valued money more than their children's emotional well-being. The trial received massive media coverage. Every day brought new revelations about the extent of the Darwins' deception. The jury heard how John had lived next door while his sons visited. They heard about the false documents and the fake identity. They heard about the trips to Panama and the property investments there. They saw the photograph that had exposed the whole scheme. In July 2008, John Darwin was found guilty of fraudulently claiming a death benefit and obtaining a money transfer by deception. He was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months in prison. And Darwin was also found guilty of fraud and money laundering. She was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. The judge was scathing in his remarks. He noted that this was not a victimless crime, that John and his own sons had been victims of cruel deception, and that they had shown no genuine remorse for the pain they caused. But the story doesn't end with the convictions. In many ways, that's where the most difficult part of the story begins. Because now John and Darwin had to live with what they'd done. They had to exist knowing that they destroyed their relationship with their sons, that they'd put their children through years of unnecessary pain, and that they'd done it all for money. They eventually lost anyway. The insurance companies sued to recover the fraudulent payouts. The Darwins had already spent much of the money on their properties in Panama and their living expenses, but what remained was seized. They ended up with nothing except criminal records and estranged children. And Darwin served her sentence and was released from prison in March 2011. She had served just under 3 years. Upon her release, she attempted to contact her sons to rebuild some kind of relationship with them. They wanted nothing to do with her. Mark and Anthony Darwin both made public statements saying that they had no desire to have their mother in their lives. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too raw, and gave interviews after her release in which she expressed regret for what she'd done. She said that she wished she could go back and make different choices. She said that losing her sons was a punishment far worse than prison, but her expressions of remorse rang hollow to many people. How could someone who had willingly participated in such a cruel deception for so long claim to be genuinely sorry? Actions speak louder than words, and Ann's actions had spoken volumes about her priorities. John Darwin was released from prison in January 2011, having served about half of his sentence. Unlike Ann, he made no public expressions of remorse. He didn't give interviews or issue apologies. He simply tried to disappear from public view, to live quietly and avoid attention. Both Mark and Anthony made it clear that they had no interest in reconciling with their father. The relationship was over. Some betrayals cannot be forgiven, and this was one of them. In the years since their release, and Darwin has continued to occasionally speak to media. In one interview, she claimed that she'd been living a lie for years and that the stress of maintaining the deception had been overwhelming. She described how she had to act grief-stricken whenever her sons visited, how she had to remember what lies she'd told to whom, and how she had lived in constant fear of being discovered. But these admissions, rather than generating sympathy, only reinforced how calculated and sustained the deception had been. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single bad decision. This was years of deliberate, daily lies. The Darwin case raises profound questions about family, loyalty, and morality. What drives parents to betray their own children so completely? Financial desperation can certainly explain the initial decision to fake a death and claim insurance money. We've seen countless cases of insurance fraud motivated by debt and financial pressure. But the Darwin case goes beyond typical fraud. Most insurance fraudsters don't have children who they force to grieve unnecessarily. Most don't hide next door, listening to their children cry. The psychological makeup required to do what John and Darwin did is difficult to comprehend. Psychologists who have studied the case have suggested various explanations. Some point to a kind of moral disengagement where people convince themselves that what they're doing isn't really wrong or isn't really hurting anyone. They rationalize their behavior in ways that allow them to continue without overwhelming guilt. John and Ann may have told themselves that their sons would eventually get over grief, that the insurance companies could afford the loss, and that they deserved a fresh start. These rationalizations are common among people who commit fraud and other white-collar crimes. They create a mental framework in which their actions are justified or at least understandable. Others have suggested that John Darwin may have had narcissistic personality traits that allowed him to prioritize his own needs and desires above those of his children. Narcissists often lack empathy and struggle to understand or care about the emotional impact of their actions on others. If John Darwin was primarily concerned with his own financial situation and his own desire for a new life, he may simply not have fully considered or cared about what his disappearance would do to his sons. Anne's motivations are slightly different. She claimed at trial that she had been coerced by John, but the evidence suggested she was a willing participant. Some have speculated that she was codependent, that her relationship with John was more important to her than her relationship with her sons, and that she went along with the scheme to preserve her marriage. But these psychological explanations, while interesting, don't really answer the fundamental question: how does a parent do this to their children? Most of us would consider our children's well-being to be paramount. We would sacrifice almost anything to protect them from pain. The idea of deliberately causing them profound emotional trauma is anathema. And yet John and Darwin did exactly that. They chose money over their children. They chose their own comfort and security over their sons' emotional well-being. In doing so, they revealed something about themselves that their sons could never forgive. The impact on Mark and Anthony Darwin cannot be overstated. Imagine grieving for a parent, going through all the stages of loss, gradually learning to accept that they're gone, and then discovering they were alive the entire time. The psychological whiplash would be enormous, but it's not just the shock of discovery. It's the realization that your parents thought so little of you that they were willing to put you through that pain. It's the knowledge that while you were crying at their memorial service, they were alive and in hiding. It's the understanding that you were valued less than insurance money. Both sons have spoken about the lasting trauma of the experience. Anthony Darwin said in one interview that he went through periods of intense anger, depression, and feelings of worthlessness. He questioned everything about his childhood and his relationship with his parents. Were they ever really loved? Had it all been fake? These are questions that children of deceitful parents often struggle with. The betrayal taints every memory, casting doubt on moments that once seemed genuine. Mark Darwin described similar feelings. He said that learning the truth had shattered his ability to trust people. If his own parents could lie to him so completely, who could be trusted? This kind of betrayal can have ripple effects throughout a person's life, affecting their relationships, their mental health, and their fundamental sense of security in the world. The Darwin case also highlights the role of photography and digital evidence in the modern age. It was a single photograph, posted online by a real estate company in Panama, that ultimately exposed a fraud. Before the internet age, John and Darwin might have gotten away with their scheme. They could have lived quietly in Panama, and no one would have been the wiser. But in an age where photographs can be easily shared, searched, and indexed online, maintaining a false identity becomes exponentially more difficult. That photograph from Panama was taken in 2006, but it didn't surface and connect to the Darwin case until late 2007. Someone, possibly a journalist or a detective working the case, found it through an internet search. The photograph was the smoking gun that proved John had been alive and traveling internationally years before he walked into that police station with his amnesia story. This case has been the subject of numerous documentaries, articles, and even a television drama. The ITV series A Thief, His Wife, and Canoe dramatized the events, starring Eddie Marsan and Monica Dolan as John and Darwin. The series attempted to show the psychological journey of the couple as they descended deeper into their web of lies. It also portrayed the devastating impact on their sons. The public fascination with the Darwin case stems from its sheer audacity and from the moral questions it raises. We're drawn to stories of deception, but we're especially drawn to stories where the deception involves such a profound betrayal of familial bonds. In the years since the case, there have been occasional updates about the family, and Darwin has reportedly moved away from Seaton Carew and lives a quiet life elsewhere in England. She has given a few interviews where she continues to express regret, though her sons remain unmoved. John Darwin has maintained a much lower profile. There are reports that he remarried after his release from prison, though details are scarce. Both Mark and Anthony Darwin have largely stayed out of the public eye. They've built their own lives, separate from their parents, and the notoriety of the case. They've both said in various statements that they want to be known for who they are, not for what their parents did to them. The legal consequences of the Darwin case extended beyond John and themselves. The case prompted insurance companies to review their procedures for death claims. It highlighted vulnerabilities in the system that fraudsters could exploit. While death certificate fraud has always been a concern, the Darwin case showed how sophisticated and long-term such schemes could be. Insurance companies began implementing more robust verification procedures, including more thorough investigations before paying out large death benefits, cross-referencing international databases, and being more skeptical of claims involving missing persons where bodies are never recovered. The case also had implications for how authorities handle missing persons cases. The assumption had always been that if someone goes missing in circumstances suggesting death, and if extensive searches turn up no evidence of survival, then death can reasonably be presumed. The Darwin case showed that this assumption could be exploited. While authorities can't treat every missing persons case as potential fraud, there's now more awareness that faking one's own death, while rare, is possible and sometimes successful. From a moral and philosophical standpoint, the Darwin case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. We like to think that parental love is unconditional, that parents will always prioritize their children's well-being above their own desires. But the reality is more complex. Some parents are selfish. Some parents are capable of extraordinary cruelty. Some parents prioritize their own needs above those of their children. The Darwin case is an extreme example, but it's part of a broader pattern. Every day, children are betrayed by parents who are supposed to protect them. The betrayals take many forms, from neglect to abuse to emotional manipulation. The Darwin case stands out because of its audacity and because it was so public. But the underlying dynamic of parental betrayal is unfortunately common. What makes the Darwin case particularly tragic is that it was entirely avoidable. John and Darwin were facing financial difficulties, but they weren't facing homelessness or starvation. They had options. They could have declared bankruptcy. They could have sold their properties and downsized. They could have sought financial counseling. Yes, these options would have been difficult and uncomfortable. They would have meant acknowledging failure and making significant lifestyle changes, but they wouldn't have required traumatizing their children. The Darwins chose a path that prioritized their own comfort and pride over their son's emotional well-being. That choice revealed the true nature of their character. There's also something to be said about the role of Darwin in all of this. While John was the primary architect of the scheme and was a willing participant, she could have refused to go along with it. She could have told her sons the truth at any point during those 5 years. Every day that she maintained a lie was another day that she chose the fraud over her children. Her claims at trial that she was coerced or manipulated don't hold up under scrutiny. She made independent trips to Panama. She actively claimed the life insurance money. She comforted her sons while knowing their father was alive. These were choices. She had agency, and she used that agency to perpetuate a cruel deception. The question of forgiveness looms large over the story. Should Mark and Anthony Darwin forgive their parents? Some people believe that family bonds are sacred, that children should forgive their parents almost regardless of what they've done. Others believe that some actions are unforgivable, that certain betrayals break the bond of family irrevocably. There's no right answer here. Forgiveness is a deeply personal choice. What's clear is that Mark and Anthony have chosen not to forgive, at least not yet, and perhaps not ever. They've decided that their emotional health and well-being require distance from the people who hurt them so profoundly. That's their right, and arguably, it's a healthy choice. The Darwin case reminds us that truth has a way of emerging, often when we least expect it. John and thought they'd gotten away with it. They'd made it through the difficult early years of the fraud. John had successfully created a new identity. They'd moved to Panama and were starting their new life. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. And then one photograph, posted by a real estate company on their website, unraveled everything. The truth had been waiting to be discovered, and eventually it was. This pattern repeats itself again and again in cases of fraud and deception. People think they've covered their tracks, eliminated all evidence. But there's always something. A photograph, a receipt, a witness, a digital trail. The truth wants to be found. What would have happened if that photograph had never surfaced? Would John and Darwin still be living in Panama, enjoying their fraudulent windfall? Possibly. Would their sons have ever learned the truth? Maybe not. And in some ways, that might have been better for Mark and Anthony. Ignorance can be bliss. If they'd never known their father was alive, they could continue to grieve him as a man who died in a tragic accident. The memory would have been sad, but clean. Instead, they had to grapple with the knowledge of their parents' betrayal. They had to revise their entire understanding of their family and their childhood. The truth set them free in one sense, but also burdened them with knowledge they might have been happier without. The final chapter of the Darwin story is still being written. John and Annan are both out of prison now, living separate lives, estranged from their children. Mark and Anthony have moved on, building lives independent of their parents and the scandal that engulfed their family. The four of them may never speak again. The family has been broken, perhaps permanently, by the choices John and Annan made. And for what? For money that they ultimately lost anyway? For a few years living in Panama, before it all came crashing down, the cost-benefit analysis of their fraud is staggeringly negative. They gained relatively little and lost absolutely everything that mattered. If there's a lesson to be drawn from the Darwin case, it's this. The choices we make define us, and some choices have consequences that echo for the rest of our lives. John and Darwin chose money over family. They chose comfort over integrity. They chose deception over honesty. And those choices cost them their sons, their freedom, their reputation, and ultimately their self-respect. You can't put a price on family. You can't put a price on trust. Once broken, these things are nearly impossible to repair. The Darwins learned this lesson the hard way, and their sons paid the price for their parents' moral bankruptcy. The photograph that revealed John Darwin was alive sits as a monument to the power of truth and the inevitability of discovery. It's a reminder that in our interconnected digital age, disappearing is harder than ever. But more than that, it's a symbol of how one moment, one piece of evidence, can unravel years of deception. That photograph shocked the world not just because it proved fraud, but because it revealed the depths of parental betrayal. It showed us that even the bonds we consider most sacred can be sacrificed on the altar of greed and selfishness. And it stands as a warning to anyone who thinks they can lie their way to a better life. The truth is patient. It can wait, but eventually it will be found.